Hey there, welcome back. Tonight, we were taking a quiet journey into the darker corners of the ancient world, the places where people worked not for glory or riches, but simply to stay alive one more day. These were the most dangerous jobs of antiquity. The miners who vanished beneath mountains, the tanners who breathed in slow poison, the sailors who felt the ocean tilt under their feet, and the soldiers whose armor was more hope than protection. At first glance, you might imagine ancient life as slow, simple, maybe even peaceful. But the truth is, some professions were essentially a whispered negotiation with death. Not dramatic, not heroic, just everyday tasks that could turn fatal in a blink. Tonight, you'll learn why these jobs existed, what made them so perilous, and how the people inside them endured. You'll see how a lamp maker's workshop smelled of burning pitch, why Roman sewer workers carried sticks to test the air before stepping inside, and how pyramid builders balanced on scaffolds that swayed like tired reeds. Just a soft exploration into lives lived on the edge. Before we begin, if you enjoy drifting through history with me, you can subscribe. And if you'd like, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is over there. I always imagine these stories landing softly across different rooms, different nights, different quiet moments. Now, let us step into the first of these perilous worlds, one lit by flickering flames far beneath the earth. Part 2. Beneath the Earth, the perilous life of ancient miners. Long before empires forged their crowns or armies marched across bright plains, the most dangerous work of all happened far from sunlight. Imagine descending into the earth with only a clay lamp, its flame trembling as if unsure whether it should follow you. The air thickens, the walls narrow, and the deeper you go, the more every sound, a crack, a sigh, a falling grain of dust, feels like a warning whispered into your ear. Ancient miners lived this reality every day, whether in Egyptian turquoise mines, Anatolian copper tunnels, or Roman gold shafts in Hispania. The work shared the same cold truth. The mountain never promised to let you leave. You might find glittering ore, or you might hear the wrong sound at the wrong moment. Have you ever noticed how silence can sometimes feel heavier than noise? Down here, silence pressed like a second layer of stone. Some miners carried small birds in cages, not for companionship but for survival. When the bird grew still, they knew the invisible dangers, gas, lack of oxygen, were arriving before they could be felt. And the lamps, well, those flames flickered with their own strange language. A steady glow meant hope. A sudden lean meant run, if running was still possible. You can almost picture a worker pausing, holding his breath as the light quivered, trying to decide whether it was just a draft or something far more ominous. Dust coated everything. It clung to eyelashes, settled on tongues, turned every exhale into a faint cloud. And the tools were simple: stone hammers, bronze chisels, wooden wedges soaked in water so they'd expand and crack the rock. Practical, clever, and noisy. Very noisy. The sound carried for meters in narrow tunnels, bouncing around like a restless spirit. If you've ever tapped on a hollow wall and felt the vibration in your fingertips, imagine that sensation stretched across hours. Breaks were rare. Meals were simple, sometimes too simple. A little grain, a rough piece of bread, maybe a dried fig if fortune was kind. Hardly a feast. Yet miners joked in their quiet, tired way that at least the food couldn't go anywhere. And strangely, that kind of humor, thin, worn, but human, held them together. You've probably had days when a small joke softened the weight of everything. They did too. The worst danger was collapse. Not a dramatic, thundering event like in films, but a slow shift. A whisper, a soft crumble that grew teeth. A miner might hear a faint crack behind him and feel every hair on his arms rise as though the mountain itself was drawing breath. Some prayed, others hurried, some simply closed their eyes for a moment and waited to learn whether destiny chose to spare them. And yet, despite all this, mining built civilizations. Copper became tools, gold became currency, salt became wealth, Every glittering artifact in a museum carries the memory of someone who hammered at a wall in darkness, someone who risked everything for a handful of ore that would be melted, shaped, polished, and admired by people who never knew the name behind the labor. The air grows heavier as we follow these workers deeper. The lamps sway, the path narrows. Listen to the rhythm of the picks, steady, stubborn, almost like a heartbeat. Even in danger, people found a rhythm to survive. Part 3. Under the sun and the scaffolds. Builders on the brink step out of the mines for a moment and feel the sudden rush of sunlight. It's warm, almost comforting, until you realize the brightness reveals an entirely different kind of danger. Ancient builders, the workers who raised temples, pyramids, palaces, and city walls, faced risks that didn't hide in the dark. They stood beneath open skies, where every stone was heavy, every platform swayed, and every miscalculation carried consequences as severe as any cave-in. Imagine a towering scaffold made of wood, lashed together with rope. No metal bolts, no safety rails, just beams creaking like old floorboards. A light wind passes and the entire structure shifts, gently, but enough to make your stomach tighten. Builders climbed these frames every day, carrying blocks that would challenge even a modern crane. Have you ever lifted something so awkward that your body disagreed before your mind did? Now imagine lifting that weight while standing 30 or 40 meters above the earth. The work demanded coordination. Teams moved stones by rolling them on logs, tugging them with ropes, or guiding sledges over slick mud to reduce friction. You can almost hear the grunts, the rhythmic calls, the soft scrape of wood dragging across packed soil. Occasionally, someone would mutter a small joke, something about the stone refusing to cooperate, and the group would share a weary smile before pushing again. Humor didn't fix the danger, but it loosened the fear just enough to keep their hands steady. Falls were the most common threat. A misplaced step, a frayed rope, a sudden slip of sand. Any of these could send a worker tumbling. And there were no soft landings. Ancient texts rarely describe these accidents directly, but you can sense their presence between the lines. Extra workers summoned unexpectedly, schedules quietly delayed, a subtle shift in tone when construction was described. Danger became part of the architecture, baked into the foundation like the first layer of mortar. Then there was heat, not warm sunlight, but hard, punishing heat that pressed into skin like a heavy hand. Builders often worked from sunrise to sunset, their shadows stretching and shrinking across the day like tired companions. Sweat soaked through linen cloth, leaving faint salt stains that stiffened as they dried. If you've ever felt your thoughts slow on a hot afternoon, imagine that sensation while balancing on a beam no wider than your foot. Still, many took pride in their craft. They knew the walls they raised would outlast them, sometimes by thousands of years. Maybe that's why they stayed focused, even when chiseling stone at precarious angles or guiding massive blocks into exact positions with only ropes and intuition. You can almost picture a builder stepping back, squinting at a newly placed stone, and giving a small nod of approval. A quiet, good enough, spoken in a world without modern measurement tools. Construction also meant improvisation. If a beam cracked, they replaced it. If the ground shifted, they adjusted. If the plan changed, and plans always changed, they adapted without question. Their job wasn't just to lift, push, or carve. It was to solve problems while balanced between earth and empty air. And through it all, the structures grew, stone by stone, layer by layer, like a massive conversation between people and the land they shaped. When you look at an ancient monument today, solid and unwavering, it's hard to imagine the trembling scaffolds, the uncertain footing, the fragile human hands that placed each block. The sun begins to set now, washing the scaffolds in soft gold. Workers climbed down one by one, their shadows merging with the dust. Another day passed, another day survived. Part 4. Fire, Fumes, and Fragile Flames. the hazardous world of ancient metal workers. Step away from the scaffolds and follow the drifting smell of smoke. It clings to the air like a low fog, guiding us toward another group whose daily labor walked a thin line between mastery and danger, the metal workers. Blacksmiths, smelters, bronze casters, iron forgers, their craft-shaped weapons, tools, ornaments, and entire economies. Yet every strike of the hammer turned sparks into tiny warnings, and every furnace glowed with a heat that could devour a life in seconds. Picture a small workshop just before dawn. A single oil lamp flickers above a bench scarred by burn marks. The fire is cold for now, but the workers know what awaits. They feed the furnace bit by bit, charcoal, dry wood, sometimes dung, each handful releasing a crackle as if the fire is waking up reluctantly. Soon, a dull red glow begins to pulse. Have you ever leaned too close to an oven and felt that sudden wall of heat? Now multiply that feeling until the air becomes almost solid. Metalworking required precision, but it was practiced in environments that resisted precision at every turn. Temperatures rose beyond comfort. Smoke hung thick and stubborn, and fumes from molten metal drifted like invisible threats. Ancient texts occasionally mention the weakness of the chest among artisans, a gentle way of describing lungs strained by years of inhaling what should never be breathed. You might know the feeling of walking into a room where the air feels heavy and warm. Here, that sensation was simply the beginning of the workday. When the metal reached the right temperature, a shimmering orange that looked alive, the most dangerous part began. Workers lifted crucibles carefully, their hands steady despite the strain. One wrong angle, one slip of the foot on ash-covered ground, and the liquid metal could spill with a hiss that turned flesh to memory. It's strange how something so destructive looks almost beautiful, almost calming, like lava gently swirling inside a clay bowl. Tools helped, but tools also betrayed. Tongs snapped, hammers bounced unexpectedly, anvils vibrated from repeated strikes, sending shocks through arms and shoulders until muscles burned with their own silent fire. And the rhythm, the constant clang, 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 filled the air with a sound so sharp it could drown out thought. Have you ever noticed how certain sounds create a kind of vibration in your bones? Metalworkers lived inside that vibration. Humidity made things worse. In some regions, moisture settled into the ground, making it slippery. In others, it clung to workers' skin, mixing with soot to create a kind of gritty paste. Their clothes stiffened with sweat and ash. Their hands bore tiny scars from sparks, each mark a reminder of close calls. And yet, there was a quiet pride in the work, a sense of shaping the world through fire and muscle. You can almost imagine a smith pausing to admire the soft curve of a newly formed blade, wiping a forearm across his brow and muttering something like, "Not perfect, but close." Casting bronze statues brought its own set of dangers. Molten metal was poured into molds that sometimes cracked from the heat. When that happened, the metal burst outward in unpredictable streams, carving bright, chaotic lines through the air. Workers stayed alert, watching for the slightest tremor in the clay. The process demanded both courage and intuition, the kind of intuition that comes only from years of listening to the fire. And then there were the fumes, lead, tin, arsenic, metals that softened beautifully but carried hidden risks. When heated, they released vapors that settled into lungs quietly, almost politely, before beginning their long, slow damage. Some workers learned to read the color of smoke as though it were a secret message. Dark smoke meant incomplete burn. Pale smoke meant impurities rising, strange greenish wisps. Those were the warnings, the ones that prompted workers to take a few steps back and wait for the air to clear. Despite all this, the workshops were full of life. Apprentices fetched tools, hammering in uneven rhythms as they learned the craft. Masters corrected them with patient gestures, or occasionally with a small, weary joke. If you strike like that, one might say, the fire will feel insulted. There's something comforting in that kind of humor, isn't there? A simple sentence that eases the tension without hiding the truth. By midday, the heat inside the workshop rivaled the fiercest sun outside. Light filtered through cracks in the walls, forming bright stripes that danced across rising smoke. Everything shimmered. Tools, flames, even the faces of the workers. Their eyes narrowed against the brightness, their breaths shallow, their bodies leaning slightly toward the fire as if drawn by an invisible pull. And yet, in this dangerous choreography, civilizations found their strength. Iron tools shaped farmland, bronze armor protected soldiers, gold and silver fueled economies and adorned temples. Without metal workers, history would lose its sharp edges, its glitter, its structure. As the day fades, the fire settles into a gentle red glow, sighing like a creature finally allowed to rest. Workers wipe their hands, stretch their shoulders, and step into the cooler evening air. Their lungs expand with relief. Their clothes loosen slightly as the heat fades. Another day, shaped, hammered, and survived. Part 5, poisoned by their own craft, tanners, dyers, and the silent threat of ancient chemicals. Step away from the ringing anvils and walk toward a quieter place. Though quiet doesn't mean safe. The air changes before the scenery does. A faint sour smell thickens, like something left too long in the sun. Another odor follows, sharp, almost metallic, and then another, heavier and strangely sweet. Welcome to the world of ancient tanners and dyers, where danger didn't come from falling stones or molten metal, but from the very substances that made their work possible. Tanners dealt with animal hides, and the process was far from gentle. First came the soaking, then the scraping, then the softening, each stage relying on mixtures that would make a modern chemist raise an eyebrow. One of the most common ingredients? Human urine. Not a pleasant detail, but a true one. Buckets of it sat under the open sky, warming in the sun, growing potent. Have you ever opened a long-forgotten container in your fridge and immediately regretted it? Now imagine doing that every morning, but on purpose. Urine wasn't the only threat. Lime, strong enough to burn skin, was used to strip hair from hides. Workers stirred these vats with long wooden poles, leaning over carefully, trying not to let the fumes sting their eyes. The smell clung to their clothes and lingered in their hair, a constant reminder of the work they did. Tanners joked that the scent was impossible to wash off. If they ever lost their way home at night, all they had to do was follow their own aroma. Then came the dyers, who created the vibrant colors that marked status and beauty across civilizations. Their craft looked artistic from a distance, vats of swirling blues, reds, and purples. But the materials carried their own hazards. Some dyes used heavy metals like copper or lead. Others were made from fermented plants that produced irritants strong enough to make eyes water from several paces away. A few came from crushed insects, ground into fine powders that drifted through the air in clouds. Inhaling too much of that dust could tighten a worker's chest and redden their skin. Among the most dangerous dyes was Tyrian purple, the coveted shade reserved for royalty in places like Rome and Byzantium. It came from the secretions of murex sea snails, processed through a long, messy, smelly method. Workers cracked open thousands of shells, left them to rot slightly, then boiled them for hours. The resulting fumes were notoriously unpleasant, rising in thick waves that coated walls and skin alike. You can almost picture a dyer stepping back from the vat, eyes watering, muttering something like, "Beautiful color, terrible perfume." Tools didn't help much. Gloves didn't exist. Masks didn't exist. If a dye stained your fingers, it stayed for days. If a chemical irritated your skin, you simply endured until the redness faded. And if your lungs felt tight from inhaling certain fumes, Well, there wasn't much to do, except hope it was temporary. The body learned to adapt, even when it shouldn't have had to. The workspaces themselves added to the danger. Floors stayed wet, slippery with mixtures of water, dye, and oils. Workers balanced carefully, knowing one wrong step could land them face first in a vat of something that definitely shouldn't be swallowed. The air felt thick, warm in some corners, cold in others, depending on which stage of the process was happening. There was always movement, cloth dipping into vats, liquid trickling down wooden planks, hides being shifted from hook to hook. And yet, despite everything, there was a strange beauty to the final results. Bright saffrons, deep crimsons, purples so rich they seemed to glow. These colors became symbols of power, wealth, or ceremony. When you see an ancient fresco or garment today, it is easy to admire the pigments without thinking about the hands that mixed them. Hands chapped from lime, stained by copper salts, and scented by ingredients most people preferred not to acknowledge. But tanners and dyers understood their craft deeply. They knew how long to soak a hide, how to balance ingredients, how to achieve the perfect shade with just a tiny adjustment. Their knowledge wasn't written. It was felt, in fingertips, in breath, in experience earned through days that hovered between danger and routine. By evening, the smells settled slightly. Workers washed their arms in basins of water that turned cloudy immediately. They laughed softly about the day's challenges, comparing whose clothing suffered the worst stains. And as they walk home, the fading light catches faint traces of color on their skin. Blues on wrists, reds on knuckles, yellows along sleeves. Tiny echoes of their hazardous craft. Part 6. Guardians of the underworld, sewer cleaners, cesspit divers, and the hidden perils below. Step away from the vats of dye and follow the sound of trickling water beneath the city streets. The ground feels different here, hollow in some places, warmer in others. You can almost sense the maze of tunnels winding beneath your feet, and down in those tunnels worked some of the least celebrated, most essential, and undeniably most dangerous laborers of the ancient world, the sewer cleaners and cesspit divers. Civilizations like Rome, Athens, and parts of Mesopotamia built impressive underground systems to manage wastewater. The Cloaca Maxima, Rome's great sewer, was engineering genius. But even genius needs maintenance, and the workers who kept these tunnels clear faced dangers that didn't roar. They crept, slow, lingering hazards that floated through the darkness long before they were seen. Imagine lowering yourself into a narrow shaft with only a small oil lamp tied to your belt. The light glows softly, casting trembling reflections on wet walls. The smell rises first, dense, earthy, sour, overwhelming. It's the kind of scent that forces your breath to shorten without your permission. And yet, these workers descended anyway, because cities needed their tunnels to flow. The greatest threat wasn't filth, it was gas, methane, hydrogen sulfide, pockets of air that robbed the lungs of oxygen. Workers learned to read the environment with instinct sharpened by necessity. They carried long sticks not for balance, but for sensing danger, tapping ahead to detect hollow spots, waving the stick near their lamps to watch the flame. If the fire dimmed or leaned strangely, it meant invisible danger had arrived. Have you ever watched a candle flicker in a draft and felt a sudden unease? Down here, that flicker wasn't a coincidence. It was a warning. Some workers brought small clay bowls of oil to test air quality. Others used birds, much like miners. When the bird grew quiet, the worker didn't stay long. Still, accidents happened. Ancient authors mention sudden collapses, workers fainting from fumes, even entire crews trapped by rising water after unexpected storms. Silence filled the tunnels afterward, broken only by the low rush of water that never stopped moving. Cesspit divers faced their own trials. In many homes, waste collected in deep pits beneath courtyards or kitchens. These pits, needed to be emptied periodically, and someone had to climb down to do it. The work was suffocating in every sense. You can almost imagine the diver pausing halfway down a ladder, squinting in the dim light, muttering to himself, "At least it can't smell worse than last week." A small joke, tired but necessary. The texture of the air changed unpredictably, sometimes warm and heavy, other times strangely cold. Rats skittered across stones, insects gathered near lamps, and above all, the walls exhaled moisture that soaked clothes instantly, clinging to skin like a second, unpleasant layer. Shoes slipped easily, tools rusted faster in the damp, and every movement had to be deliberate, almost patient. Yet these workers developed incredible skill. They knew how to direct the flow of water by shifting debris. They understood the angles of tunnels, the pressure of currents, the weaknesses in older stonework. They recognized the difference between harmless shadows and treacherous ones. And without them, ancient cities would have drowned. Not in water, but in their own waste. There's something quietly admirable about that, isn't there? The idea that some of the most vital labor happens out of sight, in places few would willingly enter. Workers went home with mud-soaked tunics, tired eyes, lungs aching from holding their breath too often. But they also carried a strange, hard-earned pride. Cities stayed healthy because of them. Streets stayed dry because of them. Life above continued smoothly because someone below embraced danger so no one else had to. As they climbed back into the evening air, the world must have looked brighter, sounds clearer. Even simple things, a clean breeze, the warmth of sunlight, the texture of dry ground, probably felt like small luxuries. Their work was done for the day, but the tunnels would call again soon, whispering with their shifting currents and restless shadows. Part 7. Between Storm and Sail. Ancient mariners and the unforgiving sea step away from the tunnels and climb toward the sound of gulls circling above the shoreline. The air brightens, the wind gathers, and suddenly the world opens into a vast, shimmering expanse of water. It looks peaceful from here. Calm waves brushing the sand, sunlight dancing on the surface like scattered coins. But ancient mariners knew better. They understood that the sea was as unpredictable as any mountain, as temperamental as any fire, and as dangerous as any battlefield. Picture a small wooden ship rocking gently at a harbor. Its hull creaks with each shift of the tide. Ropes sway. Sailcloth flutters like a restless bird. A mariner steps aboard with a quiet exhale, knowing that once they leave the shore, safety remains behind, like an old friend waving from a distance. Have you ever stood on a boat and felt that uneasy mix of excitement and vulnerability? Out here, that feeling never left. Ships in the ancient world were marvels of craftsmanship, but not miracles. A sudden storm could twist a mast like a branch. A strong wind could shove a vessel miles off course. And waves, well, waves had a habit of deciding things without asking permission. Mariners learned to read the water like a living scroll. The color of the surface, the rhythm of ripples, the sound of wind passing over open water. A thin line of darker blue meant deep currents. Tiny whitecaps hinted at approaching trouble, but even the best readers of the sea were sometimes caught unprepared. The dangers were everywhere. Storms rolled in faster than anyone preferred. Lightning cracked across the sky, illuminating faces tightened with concentration. Sailors hauled ropes with hands that burned from salt and friction. The deck became slick, tilting under their feet, each step a negotiation between balance and gravity. If you've ever walked across a wet floor and felt it slide from under you, imagine feeling that while holding a rope that decides whether your ship stays upright. Then there were hidden hazards, reefs, sandbars, unpredictable swells. Ancient maps were rarely precise, and many journeys relied on memory, instinct, and the guidance of stars. On cloudy nights, even the stars hid. You can almost imagine a sailor squinting into the darkness, whispering something like, "Clear skies would be nice, for once." A small, weary joke carried across the deck, softened by the wind. Illness traveled freely on ships. Food spoiled quickly, especially when stored in warm holds. Water turned stale. The rocking of the sea unsettled stomachs and tempers alike. A quiet cough could spread across the crew within days. Space was limited, privacy non-existent. Yet oddly enough, that closeness also created community. Mariners shared stories, songs, and small comforts. A dry cloth, a handful of raisins, a moment of shaded rest under the sail. And the work never stopped. Nets needed mending, sails needed adjusting, ropes needed checking. Night watches rotated endlessly, with someone always awake to listen for shifts in the wind. The ocean didn't sleep, so neither could the people who trusted it to carry them home. The soundscape was constant. Creaking timbers, slapping waves, low murmurs of voices, and the occasional thump of something sliding across the deck. Piracy added another layer of danger. Small, fast ships lurked along trade routes, waiting for merchants weakened by storms or fatigue. Mariners stayed alert, scanning the horizon for shapes that moved too quickly or too purposefully. The fear wasn't loud, it was quiet. A subtle tension in the shoulders, a shared glance between crew members. Despite everything, mariners loved the sea, or at least respected it. They admired its moods, its vastness, its strange calm after chaos. They knew the ocean could swallow entire fleets, yet they returned again and again because the world depended on them. Trade, communication, exploration, none of it existed without the courage of people willing to drift between storm and horizon. At dusk, the water softens. The wind lowers its voice. The ship glides steadily, its sail catching the last gold of the sun. Mariners gather near the stern, sharing a simple meal that tastes better after surviving another day. You can almost hear their laughter mixing with the waves, a fragile but persistent reminder that even in danger, humanity finds a way to breathe. Part 8. Messengers of risk, couriers, heralds, and the perilous roads between civilizations. Step away from the shoreline and follow a dusty road stretching into the distance. It cuts through valleys, climbs low hills, and disappears behind scraggly trees. This is the world of the ancient courier, a worker whose entire job was movement, swift, relentless movement. While others labored in fixed places, couriers lived in transition, carrying messages that could shift armies, reshape alliances, or save lives, if they survived long enough to deliver them. Imagine a lone rider tightening the strap of a satchel at dawn. The sky is pale, the air cool enough to feel clean in the lungs, but he knows the day will grow hotter, the roads unpredictably crowded or frighteningly empty. He checks his water, tests his horse's reins, and glances once at the horizon with the quiet acceptance of someone who understands that danger doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it waits politely behind the next bend. Couriers traveled through landscapes that offered both beauty and risk. Soft fields stretched beside forests where bandits lingered like shadows with sharp intentions. Mountain passes narrowed until the cliffs pressed in close, leaving little room for escape. Dust rose in soft clouds, sticking to skin and lips, turning every breath into something textured. Have you ever walked a long distance on a hot day and felt the dust settling on your tongue? Now imagine doing that while listening for footsteps behind you. Speed was essential. Messages had to be delivered before they lost relevance. But speed brought its own hazards. Horses stumbled, wheels cracked, paths crumbled at the edges, tempting accidents with quiet persistence. A courier running on foot, as many did in Persia, Greece, and the Andes, faced exhaustion that blurred vision and slowed reflexes. You can almost picture one of them pausing by a stream, splashing water on his face, muttering, "Just a little farther," as if trying to convince both legs and destiny. Then there were the political risks. A courier carrying sensitive information could find himself arrested, questioned, or worse, if he crossed the wrong territory. Some disguised messages in knotted cords, tiny tablets, or even scratched wax hidden beneath fresh layers. Others memorized every word to avoid being caught with evidence. Imagine the pressure, holding inside your mind a message that could provoke war, and knowing that forgetting a single phrase could shift the meaning entirely. Weather added another layer of unpredictability. Sudden rain turned dirt roads into sluggish mud that clung to sandals and hooves. Heat shimmered across plains, making distant shapes blur into illusions. Cold winds sliced through clothing, especially for couriers who traveled through the highlands. Their hands stiffened around reins or scrolls. Breath drifted in pale clouds. Sounds grew sharp and lonely in the clear air. And yet, couriers often moved with quiet determination. They knew the roads intimately, where fresh water could be found, which villages welcomed travelers, which shortcuts saved precious minutes. They recognized the smell of approaching rain, the sound of distant hooves, the sight of tracks that weren't there the day before. Their work required a strange combination of endurance and intuition, as if each journey were a conversation with the landscape. Even the mighty courier systems of empires, Persia's royal road, Rome's cursus publicus, the Inca Chasqui network, demanded human resilience. Relay runners passed messages from one station to the next, hearts thudding, lungs burning with effort. A short rest, a swallow of water, and the next runner took off. The system looked orderly from above, but on the ground, every relay depended on bodies willing to push themselves just a little further. Sometimes couriers traveled at night to avoid heat or hostile eyes. The moon lit the path unevenly, casting long shadows that shifted with the breeze. Animals stirred in the dark, not always the kind that ran away. Still, night offered a kind of peace too, cooler air, quieter thoughts, a sense of moving through time rather than space. When a courier finally arrived at his destination, there was no grand celebration. He simply handed over the message, wiped dust from his face, and prepared for the journey home, or the next journey. The work didn't pause. It flowed like a river carrying the weight of empires on its restless surface. At sunset, the road softens under golden light. A lone rider continues forward, the sound of hooves steady, 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 a heartbeat stretched across miles. And though the risks remain, each courier carries something more than danger. They carry purpose, a sense that the world stays connected because someone chooses to keep moving. Part 9, Flames at the Heart of Empire, Temple Assistants, Oil Keepers, and the Perils of Sacred Work. Step away from the long dusty roads and enter a world that, at first glance, seems safer. A world of carved stone, soft chants, and flickering light. Temples, sanctuaries, holy enclosures, where incense curled upward like delicate threads of prayer. But beneath this calm surface lived another form of ancient danger, one born not from violence or treachery, but from the fragile tasks required to keep sacred spaces alive. Imagine stepping into a temple at dawn. The air is cool, touched by the faint smell of old smoke and crushed herbs. Shadows cling to columns. A bird calls somewhere outside, distant but clear. It feels peaceful, until you notice the workers already moving quietly through the hall. These were temple assistants, oil keepers, lamp tenders, incense handlers, workers who managed the beating heart of sacred life. And while their roles carried honor, they were far from safe. Start with the lamps. Temples needed light, often dozens or hundreds of small flames that burned day and night without interruption. Oil keepers climbed ladders to refill lamps suspended high above the ground. The ladders wobbled, the flames trembled. A single drop of oil spilled onto a heated wick could flare unexpectedly, licking towards skin or fabric. And because temples were filled with wooden beams, tapestries, papyrus scrolls, and offerings made of dried plants, a small accident could become a disaster in moments. Have you ever leaned too close to a candle and felt the heat on your face? Now, imagine balancing on a narrow rung several meters above the floor while dozens of flames flicker below you. Incense burners added their own hazards. Many mixtures contained resins that sparked or popped when heated. Temple assistants tended these braziers constantly, stirring, adding fuel, adjusting airflow. The smoke curled upward in beautiful patterns, but it also filled lungs over time, coating them with fine particles. Workers developed persistent coughs, red eyes, and a kind of dizziness that arrived without warning. Yet, the ritual demanded constancy, and the smoke never stopped rising. Then there were the sacred fires, large, symbolic blazes kept alive continuously in certain temples. Maintaining these fires required lifting heavy logs, adjusting coals, and working near intense heat for long stretches. The flames roared unpredictably. Sparks leapt out like tiny sparks of mischief. Ash drifted onto robes, onto hair, onto the stone floors in pale gray layers. And still, the assistants leaned forward, careful and steady, because letting a sacred flame die was unthinkable. In some cultures, temple workers handled offerings infused with oils or powders that could ignite easily. Egyptian rituals, for instance, used substances so flammable that workers had to prepare them away from direct light. A stray spark could change a quiet ceremony into sudden chaos. You can almost picture a worker holding a small bowl at arm's length, muttering, "Please behave," as though the mixture might respond to politeness. Sacred animals added another layer of unpredictability. Certain temples housed bulls, birds, snakes, or cats considered divine or symbolic. Caring for these animals was an honor, but also a risk. A startled bull could charge. A sacred falcon might lash out with sharp talons. Even snakes used in rituals carried venom that demanded respect. Assistants learned to move slowly, calmly, always aware of where each animal rested. And then there were altars. Workers cleaned them, decorated them, carried heavy stone vessels filled with offerings. The stone edges were sharp. The floors were polished and often slippery from oils or petals. A fall here was not only painful, it was sacrilegious. The fear of dishonoring a ritual pressed on these workers as much as the physical dangers did. Yet, for all the risks, temple work held a strange tranquility. There was rhythm in lighting lamps, harmony in arranging offerings, purpose in maintaining spaces of worship. You can almost hear the soft clink of metal tools, the gentle crackle of incense, the whisper of robes brushing stone. A sacred hush settled over everything, making even danger feel muted. By evening, the lamps glowed steadily. Shadows stretched long across the floor. Temple assistants wiped soot from their hands and straightened their robes, breathing in the warm, fragrant air. Their day had been a quiet dance with fire, smoke, and devotion, a blend of risk and reverence that shaped spiritual life across civilizations. Part 10. Hunters of the Wild Edge. Animal catchers, beast keepers, and the perils of ancient creatures leave the quiet glow of the temples and walk toward the outskirts of the ancient city, where the air grows raw and the landscape begins to stretch into wilderness. Here, danger did not hide behind fumes or scaffolds or storms. It moved on four legs. It breathed, snarled, snapped branches underfoot, and watched from shadows with patient, primal focus. This was the world of animal catchers and beast keepers, people whose daily tasks brought them face to face with creatures that did not appreciate being approached, let alone captured. Imagine an ancient hunter crouching behind a cluster of reeds. Dawn light flickers across the water. He waits, absolutely still, the way only someone accustomed to risk can wait. His job might be to capture a crocodile for a ceremonial pit, a lion for a royal menagerie, or a bull too wild for farmers to manage. His tools are simple: nets, ropes, wooden barriers, but his instincts are sharp. Have you ever sensed an animal watching you before you actually saw it? These workers lived inside that feeling. Many civilizations, from Egypt to Rome to Assyria, demanded exotic animals for rituals, entertainment, symbolic power, or artistry. This meant someone had to travel deep into habitats that most people avoided. Marshes buzzing with insects and hidden jaws, forests where branches shifted with more than just the wind, mountain passes where one wrong sound could provoke a territorial charge. Animal catchers learned to read the world with extraordinary attention. A faint rustle meant movement. A sudden stillness meant preparation. The smell of the air, damp, dry, metallic, or sweet, revealed which creatures were near. You can almost picture a catcher lifting his head, inhaling lightly and murmuring, "Too quiet," knowing full well that quiet was often the loudest warning. The methods varied. Nets were thrown with practiced precision, landing like soft traps of woven shadow. Pits were dug and camouflaged. The workers had to remember their locations with absolute clarity. Stepping into your own trap was not a story anyone wanted to tell. Some animals were lured with food. Others required a coordinated chase, where dozens of workers guided the creature toward a narrow passage where it could be restrained. And then there were the unpredictable moments. A rope slipped, a branch snapped, a creature that seemed exhausted suddenly found hidden strength. These moments were not dramatic in the theatrical sense. They were sudden, raw, and fast. You can almost hear the heartbeat that follows, the breath held tight as workers decide whether to advance or retreat. Beast keepers faced a different kind of danger. Their job began after the animal was captured. They fed it, transported it, and sometimes prepared it for public events or ceremonial use. A lion in a wooden cage didn't to become less of a lion just because a cage existed. Its roar still shook the air. Its claws still tested the gaps. Keepers moved slowly, speaking in calm tones, giving the creature space when possible. They knew that an irritated animal didn't always show anger. Sometimes it simply waited for opportunity. In ancient arenas, keepers handled animals meant for performance or spectacle. They guided them through tunnels beneath amphitheaters where the smell of straw mixed with the metallic tang of fear. Human fear, animal fear, both woven together. The floors trembled faintly from footsteps above, while torches flickered, casting long stripes of light through the corridors. A keeper might rest a hand on a crate, feeling the vibration of the creature inside, and whisper a tired joke like, "Easy now, we'd both prefer this day to end quietly." Traveling with animals added yet another layer of risk. Imagine escorting a bull down a narrow mountain path, hoping it remains cooperative, or guiding an elephant across a river, trusting it doesn't panic halfway through, or transporting wolves strapped inside crates that creaked ominously whenever the cart hit a stone. Even the most experienced workers lost sleep over the unpredictability of these journeys. Despite it all, many of these workers developed deep respect for the creatures they handled. They admired the strength of a wild bull, the intelligence of a large cat, the quiet dignity of animals whose lives intersected with human rituals. A strange bond formed. Not affection, perhaps, but a recognition of shared vulnerability. Both human and animal lingered in the thin space between control and chaos. At dusk, the wild edges of the landscape soften, shadows lengthen, birds settle. An animal catcher returns to camp with a cautious step, checking once more that the ropes are secure, that the cage is strong enough, that the creature inside has settled at least temporarily. His hands smell of earth and sweat and something faintly metallic. His face carries the quiet tension of someone who spent the day confronting the unpredictable. Danger here was alive, but so was the worker who faced it. Part 11, standing on the line. Ancient soldiers, frontline fighters, and the constant nearness of death step away from the wilderness, where danger prowled silently, and moved toward the clamor of the ancient battlefield. The ground vibrates before you even see anything. A low tremor of footsteps, shouted commands, metal striking metal in hurried preparation. Soldiers, frontline fighters, guards, these were workers too, though history often tells their stories with more glory than truth. In reality, their job was simple and devastating. Stand on the line between life and loss, and hope the line held. Picture a soldier tightening the straps of his armor at dawn. Bronze or iron plates press into his chest, heavy enough to restrict his breath. A shield rests against his leg, wooden at its core, rimmed with metal that's not nearly as unbreakable as stories claim. His spear feels balanced in his hand, but he knows from experience that balance means little once the chaos begins. Have you ever held something and realized its weight feels different depending on your mood? Soldiers felt that every morning. Ancient battles were loud, but the fear inside them was quiet. A soldier's thoughts rarely shouted, they whispered. Will the shield hold? Will my formation stay steady? Will today end quickly? You can almost imagine him glancing at the horizon, noticing how the early light softens the edges of everything, pretending for a moment that it's just another morning. But the risks were relentless. In close combat, visibility shrank to the narrow space between helmets and dust. Spears thrust from angles you couldn't see. Stones hurled by slings moved faster than thought. Arrows hissed like angry insects, finding gaps armor was never designed to protect. Even the ground turned treacherous, uneven, slippery with moisture, littered with objects best not described. One misplaced step could mean the difference between life and never standing again. Heat built quickly inside armor. Soldiers in Greek phalanxes, Roman legions, or Persian infantry formations often stood shoulder to shoulder for long periods before battle even began. Breath grew hot beneath helmets. Sweat trickled down backs and necks, turning linen undergarments into sticky, uncomfortable layers. If you've ever worn something too warm on a hot day, imagine doing that with fear settling in your stomach. Then came the sound, an overwhelming mixture of clashing metal, shouted orders, thumping shields, and the low roar of hundreds of feet moving at once. It wasn't simply noise, it was pressure, a physical presence that squeezed the mind. Some soldiers joked quietly before battle, trying to ease the tension. A tired line like, "If my shield breaks again, I'm blaming the blacksmith," might draw a few hollow chuckles. Humor didn't remove the fear, but it reminded them they were still human. Wild animals sometimes joined battles too. War elephants towering above the lines, horses surging forward in cavalry charges, even dogs trained to disrupt formations. A soldier facing an elephant for the first time must have felt a kind of awe mixed with dread. The ground shook with each step, dust rising around the massive form. The soldier's own spear suddenly felt very, very thin. Sieges carried their own risks. Scaling ladders leaned against enemy walls, wobbled precariously. Defenders hurled stones, boiling liquids, or flaming debris downward, turning each rung into a decision. Soldiers below pushed forward, knowing hesitation could collapse the formation. Inside their minds, perhaps a single hopeful thought repeated, "Just reach the top." Illness struck soldiers as often as weapons did. Camps teemed with infections, bad water, and food that tested the limits of digestion. A quiet cough could spread through hundreds in days. Fatigue settled into bones. And yet the work continued, marching, training, preparing, rebuilding. Danger didn't stop just because bodies grew weak. And then there was the emotional danger. Soldiers witnessed things that clung to memory with stubborn persistence. They carried loss as silently as they carried weapons. After battles, many sat together in small groups, sharing bread or wine, not celebrating, but simply acknowledging they were still here. The night air felt sharper on those evenings, as though the world itself exhaled with them. Despite everything, soldiers formed bonds that lived beyond fear. They trusted the person beside them, sometimes more than they trusted themselves. That trust created a sense of purpose stronger than armor, sharper than spears. Maybe that's why they endured, not for heroism, but for each other. At sunset, the battlefield quiets, dust settles, echoes fade. A soldier cleans his shield, rubbing away marks that tell stories no one will hear. His movements are slow, deliberate, almost meditative. Tomorrow will come, and with it, danger. But for now, he stands in the fading light, breathing steadily, anchored by the simple fact that he survived another day. Part 12. Healers in Harm's Way. Ancient physicians, surgeons, and the risks of saving lives. Step away from the battlefield and follow the faint smell of herbs carried on a late afternoon breeze. The sound of clashing metal fades, replaced by quieter rhythms, the shuffle of feet, the clink of bronze instruments, the soft groans of the wounded. You've reached the domain of ancient physicians and surgeons whose work demanded not only skill and courage, but an unusual willingness to stand close to danger while attempting to push it back. Picture a healer preparing for a long day. His tools lie neatly arranged, bronze scalpels, bone saws, needles carved from thorns, small cups for bloodletting, bandages woven from linen. To a modern viewer, the collection might look more alarming than reassuring, but to him, each item holds meaning. Each instrument has saved lives and taken risks in equal measure. There were two main kinds of danger: the danger from the patient and the danger to the patient. Start with infection. Ancient healers had no concept of bacteria or viruses, yet they confronted them constantly. A minor cut could turn fatal. A surgical incision, even when expertly done, invited unseen threats. Physicians cleaned wounds with wine or vinegar, but these were imperfect shields. The air carried risks. The water did. Even the tools did. You can almost imagine a surgeon wiping sweat from his brow, hoping the cloth wasn't making things worse. And then there were the surgeries themselves. Trepanation, the practice of drilling or scraping a hole into the skull, required steady hands and a bold heart. One slip could end everything, but some patients survived, their skulls showing healed bone in archaeological remains. Imagine hovering over a patient, listening to shallow breaths, knowing that every motion must be exact. The pressure in that moment must have felt almost physical. Amputations were equally dangerous. Without proper anesthesia, patients thrashed from pain, forcing assistants to hold them down. Surgeons worked quickly, binding limbs with tight straps to reduce bleeding. Bronze saws squeaked through bone, the room filled with the thick scent of iron and sweat. Outside, people bowed their heads, waiting to learn whether the patient would re-emerge into the light or fade quietly. Even routine tasks held risk. Bloodletting, for instance, required piercing veins accurately. A slip could cause uncontrolled bleeding. A misjudgment could weaken a patient already clinging to life. Physicians relied on instinct, experience, and observation, tools more fragile than any metal blade. The emotional weight of failure followed them constantly. While soldiers faced danger moment by moment, healers faced it hour by hour. Each patient carried a story: a fisherman with a crushed hand, a child struck by fever, a merchant whose breathing grew shallow after a long journey. The healer stood between them and the unknowable. Success brought relief. Failure lingered. Some dangers, surprisingly, came from the patients themselves. Fevers caused delirium. Wounds caused panic. During procedures, frightened patients sometimes lashed out, grabbing at tools or pushing the healer away. A poorly aimed strike or sudden movement could injure both parties. Healers learned to speak softly, offering calm words meant as much for themselves as for the person beneath their hands. Poisons presented another hidden hazard. Many ancient physicians treated snake bites, scorpion stings, toxic herbs, and spoiled foods. Identifying the correct antidote required knowledge, and sometimes testing. A healer handling poisonous plants had to wash his hands repeatedly, though water alone rarely removed all danger. A cut on the skin transformed the smallest dose into a threat. You can almost picture a physician lifting a leaf gently, studying its shape, muttering, "Careful now," as if the plant might hear and choose to cooperate. Healers working near battlefields faced the most intense conditions. There, time turned thick and sluggish. Patients arrived faster than they could be treated. The ground was muddy, sometimes with more than rainwater. Smoke from burning wood drifted across makeshift tents. Flies gathered instantly around open wounds. Surgeons worked until their hands trembled, their eyes burning from exhaustion. They stitched, bandaged, splinted, soothed, knowing each action carried both hope and risk. But healing wasn't only physical. Physicians offered comfort, reassurance, and presence during some of life's most fragile moments. They sat beside the dying, whispered prayers, held hands, and listened to final words. The emotional toll of this work was profound. While others measured danger in swords or storms, healers measured it in heartbeats and breaths. By day's end, a healer washed his hands in a shallow bowl, watching the water cloud with traces of herbs, blood, and dust. His shoulders sagged. His face reflected quiet fatigue, not just from labor, but from carrying the weight of so many uncertain outcomes. He stepped outside and let the cool air touch his skin, breathing deeply as though trying to clean his spirit along with his hands. Another day survived, another day spent standing between life and loss. Part 13. Masters of the Inferno. Fire starters, charcoal makers, and those who lived with heat. Leave the healer's tent and step into a different kind of heat, not the feverish warmth of illness, but the harsh, smothering blaze created by human hands. Before the ancient world could forge its tools, cook its food, or fire its pottery, someone had to make the fuel. Someone had to tend the flames. Someone had to live at the fragile edge where fire becomes friend or enemy, with barely a breath between the two. These workers rarely appear in grand histories, yet their jobs were among the most dangerous on earth. Imagine a charcoal maker deep in a forest clearing. It's early morning. Mist collects in the air like thin smoke, a quiet preview of what's to come. Logs are stacked carefully, not too loose, not too tight, and covered with layers of earth and leaves. The mound looks almost like a sleeping creature. When lit, it smolders slowly, consuming itself from the inside. But if the airflow is wrong, the mound bursts into open flames, undoing days of labor and threatening anyone nearby. Charcoal making was a delicate dance. Too little oxygen, and the fire died. Too much, and it roared alive. Workers circled the mound constantly, checking for leaks, prodding vents, listening for the subtle crackle that meant internal collapse. Have you ever tried to keep a campfire at just the right level? Not too bright, not too faint. Now imagine doing that for 3 days straight, with your livelihood and safety hanging on every adjustment. The heat was merciless. Charcoal makers often felt their skin tightening, their clothes stiff with ash. The air tasted metallic, as though each breath carried a faint pinch. Their eyes watered, their throats dried, and still they walked the perimeter, careful not to step too close to the thin crust of soil that hid temperatures hot enough to burn through boots. Nearby, potters tended kilns that glowed like miniature suns. Inside, clay vessels transformed from soft earth into hardened shapes. The temperatures were so high that workers had to judge heat by color, from dark red to bright orange to a pale, almost white glow. They nudged vents, open or closed, sliding tiles into narrow gaps while sweat dripped down their arms. One careless motion could bring a wave of burning air to the face. One cracked tile could send shards flying outward like angry sparks. Glassmakers faced even greater heat. Their furnaces blazed bright enough to turn sand into shimmering liquid. Workers leaned close, gathering molten glass on long rods, turning it with slow, practiced rhythm. The glow illuminated their features, revealing lines etched by years of heat exposure. Their hands moved steadily, but you can almost feel the tension behind the calm, a quiet knowledge that one slip of the rod could cause the molten blob to fall, splattering across the floor with sizzling intensity. And you did not want to be near it when that happened. Even firekeepers in ordinary town life lived dangerously. They tended communal ovens, lit torches for events, kept beacons burning for travelers along mountain roads. Their robes often carried the faint scent of smoke, the edges singed from moments too close to the flame. Many cultures respected them deeply, others simply took them for granted, but all relied on their consistent, steady work. In some places, beacon towers lined coastlines or mountain ridges. Fires here were signals, warnings of invasion, news of celebration, or marks of passing time. Firekeepers climbed narrow steps with bundles of wood, igniting flames that had to withstand fierce winds. Imagine being perched on a cliffside, the night ocean roaring below, a torch in your hand that seems to flicker nervously. Lightning storms, gusts of wind, and unstable footing made each night shift a gamble. Firefighters existed too, long before hoses, pumps, or protective gear. In Rome, in Alexandria, in Chinese cities, teams of slaves or trained workers rushed to burning buildings with buckets, hooks, and wet cloths wrapped around their faces. They climbed ladders that shook violently. They kicked apart collapsing beams. They faced smoke dense enough to feel like a physical barrier. The air shimmered from heat. Roofs caved in with terrible swiftness. And yet they ran forward while others ran away. Embers drifted like sparks of warning. Flames turned wood into roaring pillars. But these workers, whether craftspeople or rescuers, learned to see patterns in the fire, a shift in color, a sudden drop in sound, a change in the smell of the smoke. Clues that danger was becoming more than danger. At dusk, the landscape glows faintly, charcoal mounds smolder quietly, kilns cool with slow exhalations. Firekeepers extinguish their torches one by one. You can almost feel the relief in the air, a gentle loosening, as though heat itself has stepped back for a moment. For these workers, survival meant more than bravery. It required patience, humility, and a strange respect for a force that could never truly be controlled. Part 14. The Edge of the Unknown. Minstrels, messengers of myth and those who traveled without protection. Step away from the blazing kilns and follow the road again, not the well-guarded avenues of empires, but the small winding paths threading through forests, plains, and lonely stretches of land. Here walked a different kind of worker, not a courier with official protection, not a soldier with armor, not a trader with a caravan, but the wanderers, storytellers, minstrels, healers for hire, charm sellers, and traveling performers who lived between villages, carrying songs, stories, and uncertain luck. Their job didn't sound dangerous at first. What harm could come from playing a flute or reciting tales of ancient kings? But to wander the ancient world without status or escort meant confronting a different kind of peril, one shaped by isolation, unpredictable strangers, and the quiet threats of nature. Imagine a minstrel setting out at dawn. He carries a small bag of coins, a wooden lyre, maybe a flute carved long ago. His cloak is patched in several places. He hopes to reach the next village before nightfall. But the distance between settlements is long, and the landscape feels vast. Birds call from deep within the trees. The wind rustles tall grasses in ways that sound like whispered warnings. Have you ever been alone on an empty road and felt the world grow strangely large around you? That was their daily experience. Without a caravan, a wanderer was vulnerable to bandits who lurked along quiet routes. These outlaws weren't always the dramatic highwaymen of legends. Sometimes they were simply desperate people hoping for a handful of coins. A minstrel learned to read the path ahead, footprints in soft soil, broken branches, the subtle quiet that settles just before an ambush. Many avoided main roads entirely, choosing smaller trails where danger was less predictable but also less organized. Animals posed their own hazards. Wolves followed travelers in certain regions, testing for weakness. Wild boars could charge with little warning. Even harmless creatures became risky when encountered at night. The dark distorted shapes, making tree stumps look like crouching figures and shadows stretch into unsettling forms. You can almost picture a minstrel pausing, squinting into the gloom, whispering, "Just a branch," hopefully, before continuing. Weather added new layers of uncertainty. Rain soaked clothes until they clung heavily to skin, making every step colder and slower. Snow muffled sound, but hid dangers beneath its surface. Heat pressed down like a heavy hand, drying throats and exhausting limbs. Wanderers often carried minimal supplies, a handful of dried fruit, a water skin, maybe a crust of bread left from a generous host. When their supplies ran low, they relied on the kindness of strangers or silence. Arriving at a village did not guarantee safety. Some communities welcomed performers warmly, offering meals and shelter. Others viewed outsiders with suspicion, especially in times of famine or illness. A minstrel might perform by firelight, hoping to earn a place to sleep. Or he might be turned away, forced to continue walking under a moonlit sky. The boundary between hospitality and hostility changed from place to place, often without warning. And yet, these wanderers carried something vital: stories, myths, heroic songs, news from faraway lands. They connected people who lived in isolation. They brought laughter to quiet nights, wisdom to young listeners, and comfort to elders who remembered older tales. Their voices wove threads between distant communities, forming an invisible network long before roads or mail systems made such connections official. But sharing stories was not without risk. In some regions, telling the wrong tale, one that lightly insulted a leader, questioned a ritual, or referenced forbidden myths, could invite punishment. Minstrels learned to adapt their performances to the audience, sensing when to soften a line or skip a verse. Their work demanded emotional intelligence as much as creativity. Traveling healers faced similar dangers. They offered remedies, set bones, or brewed herbal teas, but a failed treatment could provoke anger from fearful families. Some communities revered them, others accused them of causing harm rather than curing it. A wandering healer learned to tread carefully, speaking gently and leaving quietly when suspicion stirred. Despite the risks, these workers embraced the road, perhaps because it offered freedom, perhaps because they felt drawn to open spaces and new faces, or perhaps because they carried a sense of purpose, to bring something meaningful, a song, a lesson, a healing touch, to places where such things were scarce. At dusk, picture a minstrel sitting beside a small fire. The flames crackle softly, warming his hands. He hums a quiet melody, one he learned 3 villages ago, one he will teach to strangers tomorrow. The darkness gathers around him, vast and watchful, yet he sits calmly, trusting the rhythm of the road and the hope that a story can be its own kind of protection. For wanderers, danger was constant, but so was the promise of connection. Part 15. Where danger fades into memory. Reflections on the workers who carried the ancient world. The road narrows one last time as we step into the final stretch of our journey. We've walked through mines where lamps flickered in warning, climbed scaffolds that trembled in the wind, breathed the fumes of dyes and molten metal, waded through sewers, crossed uncertain seas, met couriers who raced against time, stood beside animals that tested the limits of human control, knelt with healers facing impossible odds, and traveled with wanderers whose courage lived quietly between stories. Now the world grows calm again, a dusk settling over centuries of labor, risk, and resilience. Take a moment to picture them all together, not in the same place, but in the same shared truth. Danger was woven into their lives not as drama, but as routine. It didn't shout, it whispered. It hid in fumes, in shadows, in weather, in the unpredictable edge of nature and human ambition. And yet each of these workers rose every day, stretched sore muscles, steadied their breath, and stepped into the tasks that kept their communities, and sometimes entire civilizations, alive. There's something humbling about that, isn't there? How the most essential work is so often the least remembered. How the shimmering gold of empires, the towering walls of cities, the vivid colors of textiles, the polished utensils in palaces, all of it passed through dangerous hands that history rarely names. Their risks became invisible over time, but the results of their labor remain everywhere. If you listen closely, you might still hear echoes of them. The rhythmic thud of a hammer deep underground, the soft hiss of rising smoke, the creak of oars slicing through dark water, the muffled footsteps of a courier running through dawn, the cautious voice of a healer comforting a stranger, the low hum of a minstrel singing beside a lonely fire. The world remembers in fragments, sounds, textures, faint impressions carried through centuries like dust on a quiet breeze. And maybe that is the gentle lesson hidden in all this. Civilizations are not built only by rulers or generals, but by ordinary people who accepted extraordinary risks. People who worked in shadows, in heat, in cold, in fear, and in hope. People who faced daily danger with a kind of steady resilience that feels almost sacred when you think about it long enough. As the night settles, imagine these workers stepping back from their tasks, wiping their hands on worn cloth, breathing in the cool air that signals the end of another perilous day. Their faces soften, their shoulders loosen, the world quiets around them, just as it quiets around you now. If you enjoyed drifting through this story, you can subscribe if it feels right. No rush, no pressure. Thank you for spending this time here, wandering through the hidden dangers of the ancient world. The world remembers you,